just a few hours before he was crucified, gathered around the table with originally the 12 and then with the 11, because one had left into the night. Jesus spoke these words. They're found in John's Gospel, the 13th chapter, beginning in verse 34. A new command I give you, love one another. As I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. So I have a question. It's a beautiful statement that Jesus made 2,000 years ago and a world away to a group of followers, of disciples who were very committed to him. Would Jesus, to his followers, make the same statement today, 2,000 years later, a world away, in politically fractured America? So let's just suppose that Jesus lived among us today. And this afternoon, you and I are invited over to a friend's house for a Sabbath meal, some conversation, some good friendship. And so we go, we join together. Jesus is at the table, we're at the table. The blessing is offered, the meal begins, and at some point, a person known to be a Republican says, Jesus, you need to understand that Donald Trump may be a bit uncouth, but he's trying to save the country. And immediately a person who is known to be a Democrat says, save the country? What are you talking about? He's destroying the country. It's immoral what he's doing, to which the Republican replies, immoral? I'll tell you what's immoral. What's immoral is to be elected to serve the country and have no borders. That's what's immoral. And the Republican, and suddenly somebody shouts over and says, look, it's Sabbath lunch. If we're talking politics, I'm leaving. And then finally, rather quiet, timid person says, Jesus, why don't you and I go out in the garden and we'll talk together and walk together, and you can tell me how I am your own. Wow. What would Jesus say? What would he say to us, 21st century Southern California local church? Would he say the same thing he said to them all those years ago? If we're going to try to answer that question with any reasonable chance of being right, we probably need to know something about who was in that group. Who made up that gathering that night, shortly before his crucifixion, to whom he first uttered those words. Maybe the best place we can get a sense of what happened is to go to Luke's Gospel, chapter 6. I want to set the context in Luke 6. It's a key moment in Jesus' life and in the life of his mission, this mission of announcing the kingdom of God. We'll read in a moment that it's either late afternoon or early evening, and Jesus climbs a mountain. We're tempted to read that as a topographical statement. But that's not it. What it is a theological statement. Because Luke is writing against the backdrop of the Old Testament, where the mountaintop was understood to be the place where God revealed himself. So Jesus is climbing the mountain to seek an encounter with God, and he will spend the night praying on the mountain. Now understand that Luke, more than the other three gospel writers, has a deep interest in Jesus' prayer life. He shows us Jesus praying before key events like this one. So that's the context. He has crowds following him. In those crowds, there's a smaller group of disciples, people who follow him regularly, aren't just looky-loos. But tomorrow, he's going to, from those disciples, choose 12. And those 12 will become apostles. A disciple is someone who follows Jesus. We're on that lifelong, life-changing journey with Jesus together here at LLUC. That's a disciple. An apostle is someone who is sent for him, someone who is an ambassador for him, sent to help him build the kingdom he's been preaching. That's going to happen tomorrow. That will be something that makes up the foundation stones of this new edifice he builds. So Luke 6, verse 12. One of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles. They're not just disciples, they're apostles. Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. It's a list. We're trying to understand if what Jesus said to this group of people, he might also say to us today. So just a few brief observations about the list, and then I want to land on 3 of the names and invite you to consider them with me. So first of all, this is a list that appears 4 times. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts at the beginning of the early church. In every one of those lists, Peter is the first one. He's the first one named. He's the leader. He's the spokesperson. He's the one that seems to stick his foot in his mouth with regularity and without shame. Peter is the first one named. But so too, in each of the lists, there are 2 sets of brothers named at the beginning, because Peter is one of those brothers. Peter and Andrew, James and John. They are named each time at the beginning, though their positioning varies somewhat. Also, just know that in this list, there are disciples who appear to have more than one name. Take Bartholomew, for example, that is called Bartholomew in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts, but in the Gospel of John, with some scholarly sleuthing by different New Testament scholars, it appears that the same person is known as Nathaniel. So he appears to have 2 names like many of us do, a first and a middle name. But he's not the only one. Peter has 3 names. He's called Peter, he's called Simon, he's called Cephas, his Aramaic name, and so too do some of the others. But the thing that most compels me today are not those details, but 3 of the names on the list. We're sitting around this table. Jesus is there. We're wondering, would you say the same thing to us that you said to them? We are so fractured, it's a different world. You better bring maybe a different message. What would he say? 3 names. Matthew the tax collector, Simon the Zealot, Judas Iscariot. So we begin with Matthew the tax collector. I've been trying to think this week of how we can create within ourselves the same kind of visceral, emotional response to Matthew the tax collector as the people in the world of Jesus would have had. So I've thought of 3 names, 1 more historical, 2 closer to us. First name is Benedict Arnold. Benedict Arnold, who at the time of the struggle for American freedom from Britain said to the British, as an American, I will help you capture and take over West Point. It's the prized place, the protected fort. They will need this to win. If we get it, we will win. So he said, I'll get it for you, and thus became known as a turncoat, inscribed his name into the annals of history as a traitor. What about closer to our time? Does the name Robert Hansen ring a bell? Robert Hansen, for some 20 years in the FBI, stealing our secrets, selling them to the Soviets and then to the Russians, doing unspeakable damage to America's agency. Story is told in the movie Breach, sent to prison, life, no possibility of parole. Robert Hansen. Or the name Aldrich Ames, similarly, though at the CIA, divulging to the Soviets the names of American agents in the Soviet Union. It is believed that the work of Aldrich Ames led directly to the capture and death, the execution of at least 10 U.S. agents and maybe many others. Story told in the made-for-TV movie Aldrich Ames, Traitor Within. He too, along with Benedict Arnold, along with Robert Hansen, inscribed into history the word traitor beside their name. I suspect that had there been a thesaurus in the world of Jesus, had you looked up the word traitor, one of the synonyms it would have given you would have been tax collector. Because the tax collector was a collaborator with the empire. A collaborator with that occupying force so despised by the Jewish people. They lived under the crush of Rome's heavy heel, despising the subjugation of this empire, wanting to do anything possible to be free of it, praying for the arrival of the Messiah. And in the middle of that social milieu, that cultural context, Matthew, the tax collector, the collaborator, the traitor, who is not only sold out to the empire, but is also lining his pocket with the proceeds. And Jesus says to Matthew, "Follow me." He's at the table. Simon is at the table. Not Simon Peter, that's another Simon. Simon the Zealot is at the table. So what is the meaning of that sobriquet, that nickname, Zealot, Simon the Zealot? There are three possibilities. The first one being that he was a person zealous for God. Zealous for the honor of God, the name of God, the reputation of God, somebody who was sold out to God. You know the kind of person we might say of her, oh, she's zealous. She is really sold out to Jesus. Every time the church doors open, there she is. She's always volunteering. In fact, I heard the other day, she's going to take Greek so she can read the New Testament in the original language. I tell you, she is zealous. That almost certainly is not why Simon was called the Zealot. Almost certain, because there was a meaning, a cultural meaning to that term in the time of Simon. Barclay puts it maybe most succinctly when he writes this: Simon was a zealot, and the zealots were fanatical nationalists who were sworn to assassinate every traitor and every Roman they could. Barclay is right on zealots having that commitment. That's the second possibility. But Barclay may be a little bit off in time frame. He's describing a larger movement, but that violent bloodshed in which they actively engaged actually wasn't quite erupting yet. That would come. So let me talk to you about the third possibility. Reading from a Bible dictionary, these are the words. Simon was one of the 12 disciples / apostles of Jesus. He is called the Zealot, and there follow some texts, or the Canaanian, an appellative based on Hebrew and Aramaic kana, which means zealous. Zeal was a technical term widely used in Judaism of the Hellenistic period for a desire to preserve the purity of Judaism and the Jewish land, temple, and people, even at the cost of suffering and inflicting death. Simon has often been identified as a member of the Zealot party, active at the time of the Jewish revolt in AD 66 to 70, some 35 years later. But it would be more accurate to say that he represented that form of Jewish piety that was later galvanized into revolt and that provided the pattern for those who call themselves zealous at the time of the revolt. In other words, this third position is saying that was his mindset, that was his belief, that was his commitment, and everything was to some degree still simmering beneath the surface. The anger, the rage at the occupying forces, the desire to do them in. Had he been able to get away with it, no doubt he would have slipped a knife between the ribs of any Roman he could. But the full outright revolt would come some years later. In other words, it's there. It's brewing, it's stewing in his heart. The anger, the rage. We've got to find independence. Revolutionary. And Jesus says to Simon, follow me. Now, before we go to name number 3, we're sitting at the table. Thought it was going to be a nice Sabbath afternoon lunch, but all this is broken out. So I'll just ask the question. Jesus, with all due respect, what are you doing? What are you doing? Matthew, the tax collector, the collaborator? Simon, the zealot, the revolutionary? That's crazy. I'm sorry, but I just got to name it. Do you know how much immeasurably harder you have just made your task? Including both of these people in the same group? What are you thinking? Profoundly different political commitments. The third name, Judas. Now, you may have noticed what Luke does at the end of the list. He's the only one who does this in this setting. He doesn't do it in Acts, but because Judas Iscariot by that time has ended his life. But neither Matthew nor Mark do it. Luke does it. He saves the last two for the two people both named Judas. And Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Last two on the list, Judas. I don't know why, I just had an image of Judas, son of James, running around a lot of the time saying, I'm Judas, not Iscariot, not Iscariot. Please don't get me confused. Son of James. In fact, why don't you just call me son of James? Forget the Judas. I'm son of James. Even maybe into the early church, before all the stories had gotten out that Judas Iscariot was no more. Don't call me Iscariot. That's not me. Well, Luke here just lays them side by side. Judas, son of James, Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. What about this Judas Iscariot? What are we to make of him? First of all, the words of Grant Osborne, New Testament scholar, says the name Iscariot in Judas Iscariot means either man of Kerioth, a village 12 miles south of Hebron in Judea, or is a reference to the Sicarii, a group of assassins. Quite unlikely, most biblical scholars feel. Or it could be an Aramaic term meaning the false one. The first is the most likely. It designates his hometown in the same way the Nazarene did for Jesus. Judas Iscariot, Judas, man of Kerioth. The reason that's of interest is if he is from Kerioth, as it seems to be the case, then he would be the only non-Galilean in the group. Now, the reason that's interesting is that the Galileans coming from Galilee were viewed somewhat as coming from a backwater area. an area where people were hotheads, an area where people weren't always that well educated, an area where people couldn't always be trusted. And yet down in Judea, where you're closer to Jerusalem, and especially if you're from Jerusalem, you are close to the center of political and religious and economic power. Judas, in the stories that are told of him in the Gospels, seems to match that. Man of Kerioth, to be respected, knew what he was about, could help Jesus get this job of establishing a kingdom done and done right. Judas Iscariot. There's something else very curious about what Luke does when he names Judas Iscariot. If you read Matthew, at the end of the list, he says Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. If you read Mark at the end of the list, Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. But then we read Luke at the end of the list, and he says Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Became a traitor. Leon Morris, New Testament scholar, all three Gospels finish with Judas Iscariot and mention his betrayal, but only Luke says that he became a traitor. Apparently, he was faithful at the beginning. Became. Interesting Greek word, genomai. It's a common word used in many places. It describes something that changes into something. It's a word used when the tempter comes to Jesus after 40 days of fasting. If I could paraphrase it in my own words, he comes to Jesus and says, look around you, look at all these stones. A lot of them in that area, flat, kind of roundish looking stones, resembling the flat bread of the day. Comes to Jesus, you're hungry, aren't you? I can tell you're hungry. Well, look at all of these. Look at all these. They can become genomai, bread. Make them become bread. They are stones. They can become, at your command, Jesus, bread. It describes some kind of transformation. And Luke, when he writes the list of disciples become apostles, at the end says, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. Apparently faithful at the beginning. So what happened? What happened along the way? It appears, if you follow the account, if you trace his story, that he had certain very clear ideas about the kind of kingdom that Jesus needed to create and about how he himself could benefit, how he could be given power in that kingdom. One example is what happens late in Jesus' ministry when the woman comes and breaks the alabaster jar of ointment and anoints him, and people are murmuring, and Judas is back here whispering to those near him, why did he allow that? That's expensive perfume. We could have sold that and helped these poor he's always talking about. And John, the gospel writer, adds at that point, not that he cared about the poor, but he carried the bag of money. Judas appears to have had very clear ideas about what the kingdom Jesus was coming to establish should look like. They were not necessarily unlike those of Simon the Zealot, but maybe much more moderate in terms of how it is to be brought about. One wonders then, as he's following in the footsteps of this Jesus, and as he's listening to him preach, what must have happened in the heart of Judas? After all, the list we read in Luke 6, the next section is Jesus' sermon called the Sermon on the Plain, in which he says, "Blessed are you poor. Blessed are you who weep. Love your enemies." It appears that something within Judas grinds against that. That's no way to create a kingdom. Poor, what are you talking about? The poor crying. Make the Romans cry. Restore us to power. Became. It's curious that near the end of Jesus' ministry, as we're moving into the Passover weekend, the weekend when he will be crucified, as it has become clear that his life cannot last much longer, because not only are the religious forces allied against him, but now the political forces are bringing their power to bear. As that becomes increasingly clear, Judas makes one last-ditch attempt to force his hand, to declare himself king. The way Luke describes it in Luke 22 is he says that at that moment, Satan entered into him. Satan entered into him. This one who has clear ideas about kingdom and power. And Luke simply says he became a traitor. So we're sitting around the table. Started out good, got politically rough very quickly. And I'm wondering, to a group like this in fractured America, in fractured Christian America, would Jesus have the audacity, the temerity to say, love one another? Well, you've got Matthew there, tax collector. Simon there, zealot. Judas is there at a certain point and then leaves. Do you know those words we read, love one another as I have loved you? Just 4 verses before that, Judas left into the night, intent on his diabolical deed. Would Jesus say the same to us? When you put these personalities against the backdrop of their day, it gives a very different understanding to those popcorn moments in the gospel when the gospel writers said they're fighting over who should be the greatest. I once upon a time thought, well, they're fighting about who's the great, who's the most powerful, who's the best looking, who will sit next to Jesus, who will inherit the prime ministers, all of those things. They may have had some of those arguments, but much more likely the fights were over how this kingdom deals with the Roman Empire, how it deals with the weakness we have and the desire to supersede in might. Fighting. And Jesus calls them, each one, and seeks to teach them that with all the differences in their positions, temperaments, and personalities, they are to be bound together by one reality. And that's devotion to Him and love for each other. I'm not talking romantic, warm, gooey feelings kind of love. The kind of love Jesus calls us to is a love that is deeply self-sacrificing, that takes action in the interest of the other whom we don't even like. Still being willing, by the power of the Spirit, to act for their good. Would He say that again to us? He said it to that fractured group. Our son Austin sent me a text a couple of weeks ago. We were talking, he found out I was preaching on this topic, and I think he immediately began to fast and pray for his father. But he sent me a text. In the text, he said, on this podcast episode, he was listening to a podcast, something was said that stuck with him. He said, on this podcast episode, the guest talked about his faith and how it has played such a big role in his life, and he said something, these are Austin's words, he said something that has stuck with me. This is what the guest said. You only truly love God as much as you love the person you love the least. I'd run across that sentiment on other times, but it was a reminder, and it set me back again. I thought about a couple of people on the right, and a couple of people on the left, and a couple of people in leadership, and a couple of people on the news, and I thought, Jesus, have mercy. You only truly love God as much as you love the person you love the least. But that's not what hit me the hardest. What hit me the hardest was this, that the guest said on the podcast. In other words, the test of Christianity is not, do you love Jesus? Because Jesus is pretty lovable. The test of Christianity is, do you love Judas? I want to encourage you to maybe push away from that table and go out in the garden to walk and talk a bit with Jesus. Because you're going to need him if you're going to answer that question. Because maybe he's right. Maybe the true test of Christian faith is not, do I love Jesus? It's, do I love Judas?